His almond-shaped eyes, cold and sharp, radiated a chilling hostility. His piercing gaze scanned the surroundings but found no enemies as he had anticipated. Memories flooded back like a torrent. He had been poisoned, unable to speak or move, helplessly watching as his 18 iron cavalrymen passed before his eyes without being able to call for help. After 5 years, he had fallen victim to her poison again. Was she too cunning, or had he been too careless? His almond eyes brimmed with murderous intent. That woman deserved to die. He would ensure she experienced every torment imaginable, making her life worse than death. Just as he was about to move, he felt a small figure pressing against him, a little boy sleeping soundly. The child's soft black hair fluttered gently in the morning breeze, and a patch of drool had soaked through a large section of his pants. The sensation was strange. Despite his usual obsession with cleanliness, he didn't feel disgusted. Chapter 9, Uncle, are you my father? He poked the child's cheek with a finger. Hey, little one, wake up. For some reason, the boy had fallen asleep on his lap. Given his personality, he could have easily tossed the child aside and walked away. Peter Blake groggily lifted his head, rubbed his eyes, and finally saw the man before him clearly, recalling what had happened. Uncle, you look so much like me. Are you my father? Peter Blake stared in astonishment at the man before him. That face, it resembled his own by at least 80%, just as Little Chubby's father resembled Little Chubby. Peter studied him, and the man studied Peter. It wasn't rare for people to resemble each other, but this child's eyes, they were exactly like his. What's your name? Where are your parents? A hint of gentleness appeared on his impossibly handsome face. My name is Peter Blake. My mother's name is Clara Blake. She told me my father died a long time ago. She lied to me, didn't she? Peter Blake looked at him expectantly. Though he had never said it out loud, deep down, Peter really wanted a father, just like other children who had both a father and a mother. Clara Blake. The name didn't ring any bells in his mind. He had no women by his side, had never married, and certainly couldn't have a son. Suddenly, he remembered an incident from 5 years ago and hastily asked Peter, "How old are you this year?" 4 years old. You're my father, aren't you? Peter Blake blinked his strikingly beautiful eyes, staring at him intently, hoping he would nod and admit to being his father. The man shook his head. I don't know. You should ask your mother. Where is she? Perhaps he should meet the boy's mother. Peter Blake lowered his gaze, disappointment written all over his face. This man likely wasn't his father. If he were, how could he not know his mother? Peter shook off the disappointment, his usual cheerful smile returning as he grinned and said, Uncle, last night you were poisoned and unconscious. I used my mother's detox pill to save you. The man was taken aback. So that's what happened. No wonder he felt the poison in his body had completely disappeared. He had been wondering what had occurred, so it was this little rascal who had saved him. The corners of his lips couldn't help but curl into a smile. He squatted down in front of Peter and spoke gently. Peter Blake, thank you for saving my life. I will definitely repay you someday. Peter Blake shook his head, grinning widely. My mother says if you want to repay someone, you should do it immediately. If you wait too long, the repayment loses its value. Uncle, repay me right now. The man was speechless. This kid was certainly amusing. All right then, how do you want me to repay you? Peter extended his chubby little hand toward him and said, First, you need to pay me back the cost of the medicinal ingredients. That's 5,000 gold coins. Then, you can repay me an additional 5,000 gold coins. Not too much, not too little, exactly 10,000 gold coins. Hand it over. The man's usually calm face twitched involuntarily. This brat, did he think gold coins were as common as dirt? 10,000 gold coins, and he said it so casually. "Uncle, do you not have 10,000 gold coins?" Peter sized him up and down. "Uncle, you look very wealthy. There's no way you don't have 10,000 gold coins. Don't you want to repay Peter anymore?" The man's eye twitched again. How did he look wealthy? Did his face have 10,000 gold coins written on it? How do you know Uncle has 10,000 gold coins? He was genuinely curious about what went on in this child's mind. Peter pointed at the man's clothing. "Your outfit is made of black snow silk, worth thousands of gold coins. The sapphire embedded in your belt is worth at least 5,000 gold coins. The hairpin on your head, made of eternal cold jade, is an invaluable treasure, worth at least another 5,000 gold coins. And you're saying you don't have 10,000 gold coins? #### Chapter 10, Want Cash, Not IOUs. The man looked at Peter with a gaze that held a hint of admiration. This kid truly knew his stuff. But he wondered, who could have raised and taught such a sharp child? His curiosity about Peter Blake's mother only grew stronger. "But I didn't bring enough money today. Take this token, you can go to the Heavenly Flame Hall anytime to collect 100,000 gold coins." He handed Peter a black jade token. Peter quickly accepted the token but shook his head. "My mother always says, unless absolutely necessary, never accept random IOUs. Who knows if your IOU is even valid?" The man burst out laughing. Indeed, the boy's mother had taught him many clever things. "When you go to the Heavenly Flame Hall, just say Julian Quinn sent you. 100,000 gold coins, not a single coin less," Julian Quinn solemnly assured Peter Blake. Peter Blake, however, shook his head again. "I don't trust that. How about you leave something with me as collateral? Once I get the 100,000 gold coins, I'll return it to you. How does that sound?" Julian Quinn pointed to the black jade token in Peter's hand and chuckled. "Didn't you just take my token?" Peter replied, "This black jade token is worth only a few thousand silver coins. How could it possibly cover a debt of 100,000 gold coins?" Julian Quinn glanced at the blue jade piece on his waist and inwardly chuckled. "Then tell me, what do you suggest?" Sure enough, Peter Blake pointed at the blue jade pendant on Julian's waist and the icy jade hairpin on his head. "If you leave these two items as collateral, I might reluctantly accept." Peter Blake grinned, his eyes gleaming with greed. His mother had always said that missing an opportunity to make money was like defying the heavens. Others might not understand why Clara Blake, despite her considerable wealth, was so obsessed with amassing more. But Peter understood. His mother did it all for him. Peter was born with a severe illness. No matter how high his aptitude or how fast his martial arts training progressed, he couldn't escape the harsh reality: his illness was life-threatening and could take a turn for the worse at any moment. To prolong his life, his mother needed to purchase countless rare medicinal herbs. Until Peter's illness was cured, their need for money was like a bottomless pit, no amount would ever be enough. Fortunately, his mother had a highly lucrative profession. The pills she refined often sold for exorbitant prices. Peter's ability to survive until now was largely due to the vast quantities of medicine he consumed daily. For him, rare herbs were as commonplace as daily meals. ####. Chapter 11, Let me go, stop talking nonsense. He stood up, heading toward the pastry shop across the street to grab a bite before looking for his mother. If she couldn't find him, she would undoubtedly be very worried. As he walked halfway, a sharp, excruciating pain suddenly struck him. The familiar discomfort was unbearable, and though he tried to grit his teeth and endure it, he realized this time the pain was even more intense. Beads of sweat, as large as peas, rolled down his pale, delicate face as he collapsed in the middle of the road, writhing in agony on the ground. "Hey, kid, get out of the way." A luxurious carriage approached Peter, and the driver cracked the whip toward Peter Blake. "What's going on?" A calm, deep male voice came from inside the carriage, questioning the driver. Your Highness, there's a child lying in the middle of the road, the driver respectfully replied. The curtain of the carriage was lifted, and a young nobleman dressed in lavish silk stepped out, frowning slightly as he looked at the child rolling on the ground. The small, pale face was filled with pain. He looked familiar. This was clearly the same child who had caused a scene at Owen Trading yesterday with his outrageous bidding. Bring him into the carriage. A faint smile appeared on the handsome man's face. It had only been a day, and yet rumors had already spread among the people, claiming that this child was Henry Owen's illegitimate son. If he truly was Henry Owen's son, then Henry Owen owed him a great favor. The carriage sped away, carrying Peter Blake, who was in so much pain that he was on the verge of losing consciousness. Not long after the carriage departed, 18 riders stormed through the streets, searching everywhere but ultimately leaving empty-handed. Meanwhile, at the foot of a mountain 10 miles from Cherry Blossom Town, Clara Blake presented the invitation Henry Owen had given her, using the name of the Owens bloodline to request an audience with the master of Phoenix Flame Palace. It was certainly easier than a nameless woman like herself trying to gain access. However, even with the name of the Owens bloodline, Phoenix Flame Palace seemed unwilling to show any courtesy. She waited at the foot of the mountain for a full hour but still received no permission to ascend. Worrying about her son's safety, Clara's anxiety grew. Today was the full moon, and if Peter didn't take the life-sustaining pill before the moon waned, his life would be in grave danger. At this moment, every second was precious to her. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. Palace Master, someone has broken into the palace, claiming loudly that Phoenix Flame Palace kidnapped her son and demanding we return him immediately, or else what? Julian Quinn frowned, coldly staring at the guard. Or else she'll erase Phoenix Flame Palace from existence, the guard relayed nervously, cold sweat dripping down his back, fearing the wrath might fall on him. How audacious! Palace Master, allow me to handle this, Gillian Cena, the left guardian standing beside Julian Quinn, said fiercely, his face full of murderous intent. Kidnapped her son. Julian Quinn pondered for a moment before abruptly standing up. Taking the mask handed to him by Gillian Cena, he swiftly left the study like a gust of wind. On the martial training ground, a graceful figure in white was fiercely battling the right guardian, John Cena. The woman's elegant movements resembled a celestial maiden descending to earth, and though her techniques were strange, each strike was lethal and precise. Despite her cultivation being lower than John Cena's, her formidable martial skills kept her from falling into a disadvantageous position. However, if the fight continued, she would inevitably face defeat. John Cena executed a deadly move. The woman bent backward to avoid it, her long black hair cascading down like a waterfall. Her beautiful face was filled with determination and killing intent. At this moment, John Cena launched another fatal attack. The woman in white, seemingly exhausted, struggled to dodge and scathed, but it was unlikely she could do so. Julian Quinn's figure swiftly appeared on the training ground. He extended his hand, wrapping it around Clara Blake's slender waist, narrowly avoiding John Cena's critical strike. Clara Blake stared in shock at the man before her, not because of his handsomeness, as he wore a mask that obscured his features, but because of his eyes. Those rare, mesmerizing almond-shaped eyes were identical to Peter's. ##### Chapter 12, Return My Child. What? Never seen a man as handsome as I am. Julian Quinn tightened his arms around Clara Blake's waist, a sly smirk playing on his lips. It was only then that Clara Blake snapped out of it and realized she was still in his embrace. She gracefully turned and freed herself from his arms. Who are you? I don't have time to waste words with you. Call your master here to meet me. Clara Blake's face was full of irritation. She despised being touched by others, especially men. Any man who dared to lay a hand on her without her permission usually ended up incapable of taking care of himself. But this man before her, just from his aura, she could sense that he wasn't someone she could mess with easily. It seemed that if she wanted him to pay the price, she'd have to plan carefully. How dare you? Such disrespect to the Lord. John Cena, clearly lacking awareness, failed to notice the ambiguous tension between the two. Julian Quinn waved his hand, signaling John Cena to step back, then turned to Clara Blake. I am the Lord of the Scorching Heaven Hall. May I ask what business you have? So young yet already the Lord? Isn't the position of Lord usually held by old men? The people of the Celestial Temple have kidnapped my son, return him to me immediately. Son. In Julian Quinn's mind, the face of Peter Blake suddenly appeared, a small face that bore an 80% resemblance to his own. Every move the child made seemed to stir his heart deeply. Your son, is his name Peter Blake? He looked at the woman before him, thinking of Peter's pale, delicate face. A sense of foreboding surged within him. Clara Blake felt a surge of joy in her heart. He knows Peter, which means Peter is truly at the Celestial Temple. Thank heavens. Yes, that's right, Peter Blake. Hand him over to me now. At this moment, she could no longer care about Julian Quinn's expression. She only wanted to know where her son was, whether he was safe, and if he had enough to eat. Just then, the 18 Iron Cavalry appeared on the training ground. Seeing the 18 Iron Cavalry return empty-handed, Julian Quinn's face instantly darkened, and he shouted angrily, Where is he? You can't even find a child. The leader of the 18 Iron Cavalry, Koktsu, quickly stepped forward, clasping his hands as he reported to Julian Quinn, Master, when we arrived, the person was no longer there. We heard that he was taken by Second Prince Charles Anderson of the Vermilion Empire. Julian Quinn shook his head. Impossible. Peter is very clever, he would never easily go with a stranger. Koktsu spoke again. I heard the boy suddenly collapsed unconscious, seemingly due to a relapse of an old illness, blocking the carriage of the second prince, which is why the second prince took him away. A relapse of an old illness? Today is indeed the full moon, the day his sickness usually flares up, but in the past, it always started in the evening. Why has it happened so early this time? Julian Quinn caught Clara Blake, who was staggering and about to fall. Seeing her pale face, he hurriedly asked, What happened to Peter? What illness does he have? Clara Blake pushed him away. If anything happens to my son, I swear I will never coexist under the same sky with your Fan Tien palace. She glared at Julian Quinn before turning and running off. Julian Quinn had never imagined that a fleeting spring night would leave him with a son, now 4 years old. Thinking about Peter Blake's appearance filled his heart with warmth, but then remembering Peter's current uncertain fate, his heart tightened further, and an unprecedented sense of anxiety surged within him. Outside Clearwater City, Henry Owen was anxiously waiting, his face full of worry. Amid the swirling red dust in the distance, a majestic horse figure galloped forward. The taut nerves in me finally relaxed a little. You're here. I just received news that Peter is at the residence of the second prince, Charles Anderson. Henry Owen rushed forward, grabbing the reins of the fine horse Clara Blake was riding. His movements were as smooth as flowing water, as though he had done it 1,000 times before. Gone was the usual noble demeanor. At this moment, he resembled nothing more than a common servant. Chapter 13, the fiery Lady Clara Blake's worried eyes were fixed on Henry Owen's face. There's no time left, take me to the second prince's residence immediately. But I don't have a horse right now. Henry Owen hesitated slightly, not because he deliberately avoided riding one, but due to a minor incident. Without saying a word, Clara Blake reached out, grabbed Henry Owen's arm, and pulled him onto the horse. Henry Owen sat behind Clara Blake, his chest pressed against her slender back. The faint scent of lotus from her hair wafted into his nose, making his heart momentarily feel like it was floating in a dream. His hand unconsciously moved to encircle her waist, but just then, Clara Blake lashed the whip against the horse's flank. The horse neighed loudly and galloped away, nearly throwing poor Henry Owen to the ground. The jolt snapped him back to his senses, grateful he hadn't done anything inappropriate, otherwise, who knows how Clara Blake might have misunderstood him. The vast city of Clearwater stretched out before them, with the second prince's residence located at the farthest end of West Street, ironically making it the most distant of all the prince's estates. By the time they arrived at the estate, the sun was setting in the west. The golden hues of twilight bathed the residence in a surreal beauty, both breathtaking and illusory. Seeing Henry Owen, the guards opened the gates without a word, indicating that his relationship with the second prince was anything but ordinary. Clara Blake scoffed coldly. "Even if you and Charles Anderson are blood brothers, if he dares to harm a single hair on Peter's head, I will not spare him." Henry Owen wiped the sweat off his brow and quickly replied, "Rest assured, Charles isn't that despicable. He also attended the auction for the white blood herb. When he saw Peter with me and realized we knew each other, he brought the unconscious Peter back to his residence. In a way, he's actually your benefactor." As the two spoke and walked, they reached the main hall, where Charles Anderson was casually sipping tea and chatting with a beautiful young woman. "Charles Anderson, where is my son? Where is he?" Though Clara Blake had never met the man before, she instantly recognized him as the second prince of the Vermilion Empire, Charles Anderson. Charles Anderson looked at the woman who had just barged in. Dressed in pure white, her ethereal beauty was only accentuated by the worry etched on her face, making her even more captivating. This woman seemed vaguely familiar, though he couldn't immediately recall where he had seen her before. "How rude! How dare you address His Highness so casually?" The guard behind Charles Anderson erupted in anger, pointing at Clara Blake with the intention of scolding her further, but Charles Anderson stopped him. "Stand down. Bring the child here immediately." A glimmer of intrigue sparkled in Charles Anderson's eyes. He had encountered countless women, but none had ever dared to show such disrespect toward him. "Miss Blake is desperately searching for her child. I hope your highness can forgive her," Henry Owen interjected. He had witnessed Clara Blake's fierce determination firsthand and knew she was far from the delicate woman she appeared to be. For her son, she would stop at nothing. However, this was no ordinary place, causing trouble here would lead to unimaginable consequences. Charles Anderson waved his hand dismissively, signaling that it was fine. "The Owens bloodline brother, it seems your relationship with Miss Blake is far from simple." Helen Anderson, who had been silently ignored all this time, could no longer hold back. "Henry Owen, what exactly is your relationship with her?" Helen Anderson was seething with anger. That wretched Henry Owen hadn't even glanced at her since entering, treating her as if she were invisible. Did he truly think she didn't exist? Henry Owen's expression shifted, as if he had only just noticed Helen Anderson's presence. Internally, he groaned, knowing that if he had realized she was here, he wouldn't have dared step foot inside for anything. Seventh princess, it's been a while," Henry Owen stammered with an awkward smile, instinctively stepping back 3 paces to hide behind Charles Anderson. Before the 7th princess could interrogate him further, the guard returned, carrying Peter into the main hall. Clara Blake rushed over to take Peter from him, sweeping the tea set off the table to lay him down carefully. Peter's face was still contorted in pain, drenched in sweat. His breathing was weak, his consciousness unclear, and his eyes rolled back in his head. #### Chapter 14, What's wrong with him after all? Why is this happening? Why is this happening? Henry Owen paced back and forth, restless like a shuttle. Just yesterday, everything seemed fine, and now things had taken a sudden turn for the worse. Luckily, Physician Lee came to check 7th Sister's pulse. I asked him to examine Peter's condition as well. Physician Lee said it's a case of blood blockage, caused by absorbing too many toxins while still in the womb. He also mentioned that children with this condition usually don't survive. The fact that he was born and lived this long is truly a miracle, Charles Anderson recounted Physician Lee's words, his gaze filled with curiosity as he looked at Clara Blake. Just what kind of person was this woman? Can it be cured? Henry Owen asked, his heart aching as he looked at Peter Blake's pale little face. Such a lively child, and yet burdened with illness. Charles Anderson sighed and shook his head. Unless you have the blood elixir pill. But such a pill can only be crafted by an 8th-tier alchemist. You know how rare even 6th-tier alchemists are these days, let alone an 8th-tier one. As the two men spoke, they saw Clara Blake place a pill into Peter's mouth, then channel her energy into his body. White energy. The energy emanating from Clara Blake's palm was white. In the Western continent, the color of a cultivator's energy represented their level of cultivation. Energy colors were divided into 9 shades: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, white, and gold, corresponding to the 9 tiers of martial arts cultivation. Above the 9th tier were the 4 realms of heaven, earth, mystical, and mortal, with heaven being the highest and mortal the lowest. Beyond these, there existed the mystical heaven realm. Upon entering the heaven, earth, mystical, and mortal realms, the energy color would become invisible, completely concealed, making it impossible for others to discern. Clara Blake's energy, however, was white, indicating that her current tier was 8th. This woman was truly extraordinary. Even Charles Anderson, long regarded as a genius, was only at the 6th tier. Brother, I keep feeling like this woman looks so familiar, as if I've seen her somewhere before, Helen Anderson said, continuously scrutinizing Clara Blake. Since the first time she laid eyes on Clara Blake, she had this nagging feeling. They must have crossed paths before. Oh. You feel the same way? Charles Anderson looked at Clara Blake with a meaningful gaze. Peter Blake's consciousness gradually became clear. Though still in pain, seeing his mother right before him, he smiled brightly and threw himself into her arms. Mother, you finally came to get me. Peter was so scared. Peter's small head rubbed against Clara Blake's chest. Clara Blake's eyes reddened, filled with heartache. Peter was afraid of the dark, she couldn't imagine what he had endured last night. It was my fault. I shouldn't have left you to chase after the bad guy. I promise I won't do it again. She held Peter Blake tightly, tears streaming down her face. The moment Peter was kidnapped, it felt as if her world was collapsing. She couldn't lose Peter, absolutely not. Mother, I got the white blood herb. Peter lifted his head from Clara Blake's embrace, raised his hand, and a white jade bottle appeared. The faint fragrance of the white blood herb instantly filled the hall. Clara Blake was overjoyed. She had always blamed herself for failing to retrieve the white blood herb and even losing her son. But now, her son had not only returned safely but had also brought back the white blood herb. The white blood herb was a priceless treasure that everyone coveted. Charles Anderson had appeared at Owen Trading's auction house precisely because of it. Clara Blake took the white blood herb and turned to Charles Anderson and Henry Owen. Peter is in critical condition. I must refine the life-sustaining pill for him. Please take care of Peter, and request the second prince to prepare a private chamber for me immediately. Refining pills? She was an alchemist. An alchemist and, at the same time, an 8th-grade martial expert. Chapter 15, Who exactly is she? The secret chamber in the prince's residence was readily available. For the request of an alchemist, how could the deep-minded Charles Anderson refuse? The chamber was quickly prepared, and Charles Anderson personally escorted Clara Blake to its entrance. The arrogance he displayed earlier had completely vanished upon learning that she was an alchemist. Clara Blake handed a porcelain bottle to Henry Owen. This is the Ko-Young pill. Peter must take 1 pill every hour. Until I return, do not stop administering it. Remember. Under the astonished gazes of everyone, she swiftly entered the chamber, shutting the door and isolating herself completely. Ko-Young pill. A pill worth thousands of gold, and she has an entire bottle of it. Henry Owen looked at the porcelain bottle in his hand in disbelief. The Ko-Yang pill was a fifth-grade medicinal pill with significant effects in enhancing cultivation for practitioners. It was also a rare treasure. If auctioned, it could easily fetch a price of tens of thousands of gold, rivaling the value of the white blood herb. Charles Anderson stared at the tightly shut chamber door and suddenly remarked, "What did she say earlier? She wants to refine the life-prolonging pill." Helen Anderson nodded. "Yes, she said she wants to refine the life-prolonging pill. The life-prolonging pill is a seventh-grade medicinal pill. Can she truly succeed on her own?" In her impression, alchemists who reached the fourth grade or higher were always elderly individuals. A high-grade alchemist as young as Clara was unheard of. "Peter, do you usually take these?" Henry Owen shook the porcelain bottle in front of Peter. Peter nodded. "Every time my illness acts up, I have to take them. They don't taste good at all, not even as good as the life-prolonging pill." Peter, sweating profusely from pain, still managed a smile. He couldn't let his mother worry about him. He was a man, he could endure this. Wait, what? Not as good as the life-prolonging pill? Could it be that he had taken the life-prolonging pill before? It was known that the life-prolonging pill, aside from being high-grade, required extremely rare ingredients that were incredibly difficult to gather. Who exactly was Clara Blake? Watching Peter Blake treat the Ko-Yang pill as casually as candy, Henry Owen felt as if his heart was being torn apart, as though Peter were consuming pieces of his own flesh. Inside the chamber, Clara Blake took out her cauldron. The ingredients for refining the life-prolonging pill were complete, but there was only one white blood herb. She could only succeed, failure was not an option, as Peter's life depended on it. With a graceful wave of her jade-like hand, a dazzling golden flame ignited within the ancient bronze cauldron. She had never refined pills in front of others, primarily because of a unique flame she used. It was a rare fire she had encountered 3 years ago in the depths of a forest, which took her 3 months to subdue. Using this rare fire to refine medicinal extracts produced purer results and significantly increased the success rate compared to ordinary flames. This type of strange flame is a treasure that all alchemists dream of. She understood the principle of hiding her talents and naturally wouldn't flaunt it in front of others. Moreover, for an alchemist, a strange flame is not only an aid in pill refining but can also be used in martial techniques, significantly enhancing their destructive power. One by one, the medicinal ingredients were placed into the cauldron. Clara Blake skillfully controlled the temperature of the strange flame, continuously extracting the essence of the medicinal ingredients that floated out of the cauldron. "I remember now, no wonder she looked so familiar," Helen Anderson exclaimed, slamming the table and breaking the silence in the room. The second prince frowned, glanced at Helen Anderson, and said discontentedly, "You are a princess, why are you so flustered? Where have all those years of etiquette and upbringing gone?" Helen Anderson waved her hand dismissively, her face indifferent. She was already tired of her second brother's reprimands. "Second brother, do you really not remember Clara Blake?" Charles Anderson looked at Helen Anderson, his expression as if he had just realized something, and shook his head, saying, "I don't remember." "Why? Did I know her before?" Chapter 17, Did you put a green hat on him? Not just a mere acquaintance. She's the daughter of Princess and Ben. Don't you have any recollection? The two of you even had a marriage engagement. The seventh princess exclaimed excitedly, her face full of astonishment. Who would have thought that 5 years after the royal family annulled the engagement, Clara Blake would suddenly appear before them? Charles Anderson's face turned dark. That woman who had once made him a laughingstock. Clara Blake, no wonder she seemed familiar. So, it's true that enemies are bound to meet, their entanglement running deep. Henry Owen was equally surprised. Clara Blake was the only legitimate daughter of the Blake Marquis family, rumored to have passed away long ago. Yet here she was, alive and well, exuding an overwhelming aura and possessing a beauty that could topple kingdoms. Thanks to the pill provided by Yang, Peter's pain had subsided by half. Listening to the adults' conversation, the curious boy asked, "Did you all know my mother before?" Henry Owen coughed awkwardly, glancing at Charles Anderson, whose face was livid, and nodded at Peter Blake. "We've never met her in person, only heard of her reputation." Charles Anderson looked up at the blue sky and white clouds, and the humiliation from 5 years ago came rushing back. He had actually saved the son of his former fiancée and her lover. If word of this got out, how would he ever show his face again? The Owens bloodline uncle, this uncle over here doesn't seem very happy. Does he have some grudge against my mother? Peter Blake, sharp and perceptive, couldn't miss the anger written all over Charles Anderson's face. Henry Owen let out a dry laugh and stepped forward to pat Charles Anderson on the shoulder, speaking in a low voice, "It's all in the past now. Let it go. You've seen Clara Blake's strength for yourself. Don't let a moment of anger ruin things. You should understand the value and power of a high-ranking alchemist." Charles Anderson glared at Henry Owen and retorted angrily, "Easy for you to say. You're not the one who got cuckolded." Although the Vermilion Empire valued martial prowess, it was also a nation with conservative customs, where a woman's reputation was of utmost importance. But Clara Blake, as the daughter of Princess and Ben and the Blake Marquis family, and his fiancée no less, had shamelessly tangled with a man in a temple, became pregnant, and put a glaring green hat on him, a humiliation he could never erase. "Uncle, did your wife make you wear a green hat?" Peter endured the pain as he jumped off the table, walking up to Charles Anderson with a face full of sympathy. His mother once said that no matter how majestic or powerful a man might be, if he's cheated on by a woman, he'll become a laughingstock, a loser in the eyes of the world. So Peter vowed that if he ever got married, he'd make sure to properly teach his wife and never give her a chance to cheat. Charles Anderson's eyebrows twitched as he gritted his teeth and said, "She's not exactly my wife, but we were once engaged. And yet. Before Charles could finish, Peter interrupted with a grin, "Uncle, my mother says women cheat for 2 reasons, either they are naturally promiscuous, or their man cannot satisfy them. That's why they seek someone else. Someone as noble as you would never marry a naturally promiscuous woman, right? So, could it be that in some way, you couldn't satisfy her? Is that why she cheated on you?" Peter shook his head vigorously. Although he didn't quite understand what, in some way, meant, his mother had said so, and she also told him he'd understand when he grew up. Charles Anderson's face grew darker and darker. He wanted nothing more than to storm into the secret chamber and demand an explanation from her. What did she mean by, in some way? She hadn't even tried, so how could she know he couldn't satisfy her? And yet she was already craving another man. Henry Owen struggled to suppress his laughter, almost injuring himself in the process. Clara Blake, of all things, why teach a child about this? Hashtag Chapter 18, Anger. The unlucky child Helen Anderson, though unmarried, understood a bit about life. Hearing Peter Blake's long-winded explanation, her face immediately turned beet red. She glared at Peter before covering her face and rushing out of the main hall. The full moon rose high, and Peter's pain grew increasingly unbearable. His small, pale face was devoid of any color, sweat as large as beads rolled down his cheeks, soaking his clothes. His handsome face contorted with agony, yet he bit his lip, refusing to utter a single sound. Henry Owen sat beside him, tightly gripping the boy's small hand. "Peter, if it hurts, cry out. Otherwise, you'll bite through your lip." Peter shook his head. "Mother will worry." "I can't let her worry." Such a simple statement deeply moved the 2 grown men. Such a young child, yet he endured the pain silently just to avoid worrying his mother. How must his mother feel, seeing her son this way? Both men felt their hearts ache for Peter's resilience, and even more so for Clara Blake, who loved her son more than life itself. As Peter grew weaker, breathing more out than in, unable even to speak, the two men anxiously paced back and forth. Clara Blake had made it clear, if the elixir wasn't ready by dawn, Peter would lose his life. Such a lovable child, why did fate treat him so cruelly? If Peter Blake were to die, what would become of Clara Blake? Henry Owen dared not imagine it, his heart clenched as he silently prayed countless times to Buddha. Before dawn, the tightly shut door of the secret chamber finally opened. A strong medicinal aroma wafted out, permeating every corner of the Crown Prince's residence. She rushed into the main hall, where Peter was so weak he was barely breathing. She pushed Henry Owen aside, trembling as she placed a fiery red pill into Peter's mouth, channeling her energy to help the medicine flow into his stomach. She desperately rubbed Peter's icy hands, muttering repeatedly, "It'll be okay, everything will be okay." As morning broke, Charles Anderson immediately sent someone to summon Dr. Lee. When Dr. Lee arrived, he saw Clara Blake clutching Peter Blake tightly, her eyes vacant and lifeless. Observing Peter Blake in her arms, he noticed the boy's face was as pale as a sheet, his pulse had stopped, and his chest no longer rose or fell, he was clearly dead. Seeing Dr. Lee shake his head and sigh, Henry Owen's heart wrenched. He lunged forward, grabbing Dr. Lee's arm and shouting, "Didn't you claim to bring the dead back to life? Save him." Dr. Lee sighed again. "I am but a physician, not a deity. How could I possess the divine power to resurrect the dead? Such a pity, so young, and yet." "Shut up, get out, all of you, get out, don't disturb Peter's rest, all of you, get out." Clara Blake roared angrily, waving her hand as a surge of white energy burst forth, pushing everyone out of the main hall. Dr. Lee sighed deeply, turned around, and left. He had spent his entire life practicing medicine, witnessing countless separations of life and death, seeing the old bid farewell to the young. How could such moments ever be few? Clara Blake held Peter Blake in her arms, staying awake for 3 days and 3 nights without eating, drinking, or even changing her posture. Charles Anderson couldn't help but shake his head and sigh. So stubborn, just like mother and son alike. At that moment, he seemed to catch a glimpse of a small, soft hand hanging limply, with its fingers twitching slightly. Thinking he was imagining it, he rubbed his eyes and looked again. Those chubby little fingers had moved. He was stunned. My God, the boy isn't dead, the boy is still alive. He rushed into the main hall, shouting to Clara Blake, Peter isn't dead, the boy isn't dead. I just saw his fingers move. Clara Blake, momentarily dazed, lifted her head to stare intently at Charles Anderson's excited face, and irritably responded. #### Chapter 18, If you die, he still won't, of course, Peter isn't dead. Even if you die, he won't. Looking at Clara Blake's calm expression, it was obvious she already knew Peter wasn't gone. Yet, she clung to him like that, motionless as a statue for 3 whole days and nights. I even thought she had gone mad from the shock of her son's death. Noticing Charles Anderson's confusion, Clara Blake casually explained, the life-extending pill has incredibly potent properties. It can temporarily suppress the toxins in Peter's body. It's like a life-or-death battle. If the pill wins, Peter will survive. If it loses, Peter will definitely go. During this time, Peter absolutely cannot be moved, or it will disrupt his energy flow. Clearly, the life-extending pill had won. That explained why Clara Blake had remained steadfast for 3 days and nights without moving. Can we move now? Charles Anderson asked, noticing Peter Blake's face gradually regaining its color. Clara Blake pouted. 3 days and nights of enduring had worn her out, but her beauty remained impeccable, perhaps even more delicate, evoking a sense of compassion. I'd love to get moving, but my legs are completely numb. What can I do? 3 days and nights without moving, of course, she'd feel numb. Charles Anderson looked at her, then suddenly bent down and scooped Clara Blake into his arms. Carefully, He also held Peter Blake, who was still cradled in her embrace, and turned to head toward the study behind the main hall. Clara Blake didn't resist. She gazed up at the man in front of her, handsome, strong, exuding a regal aura, just as she remembered. In truth, she had recognized him back at the treasure pavilion. Charles Anderson, seated in the VIP room next door, was none other than Clara Blake's former fiancé. In her memory, Charles Anderson had always been indifferent to her. Though they hadn't interacted much, he never once looked her in the eye. He even secretly complained to the Empress, bluntly stating he didn't want to marry into a Marquis that was in decline. Looking at Charles Anderson's handsome face, her mind naturally conjured the image of Julian Quinn. Though he wore a mask, she still felt that behind it must lie an extraordinary visage. She shook her head. Why was she thinking about him? She had never even seen his face. Charles Anderson gently laid Clara Blake down on the bed in the study, then called in 2 maids and instructed them to massage her legs. "Thank you, Your Highness. I will surely repay your kindness one day," she said, nodding at Charles Anderson. Toward him, she felt neither much affection nor any particular dislike. "Where is Henry Owen?" she asked, glancing around, but not seeing Henry Owen anywhere. She found it strange. Over the past 3 days, though she had neither moved nor spoken with anyone, she knew Henry Owen had always been keeping watch outside. "Miss Blake, there's no need to be so formal. Henry Owen is likely at the 4th Prince's residence right now," Charles Anderson replied nonchalantly, his lips tightening into a faint smile, both smug and mocking. Clara Blake didn't miss the trace of mockery in his smile. She knew he must have discovered her true identity, so she spoke frankly. "Did he go to see my maternal grandfather?" Her mother was the legitimate daughter of the 4th Prince of the Vermilion Empire, Princess Ping, making the 4th Prince her maternal grandfather. She still remembered the past vividly. Years ago, Clara Blake had been caught in a compromising situation at a temple, the air thick with the scent of scandal. Even a fool could guess what had happened. Her father, the Marquis of the Blake family, had been enraged and wanted to petition the emperor for her execution as an unfilial daughter. If it hadn't been for her grandmother and maternal grandfather's unwavering protection, she wouldn't have survived to leave Qingyang City, let alone become the Clara Blake of today. The Owens bloodline feared you might lose your mind over Peter and felt it inappropriate to ask your father-in-law for help, so he went to the 4th Prince's residence, Charles Anderson explained. Clara Blake shrugged indifferently. Her impression of her maternal grandfather was still quite positive. He was kind and compassionate, always treating her warmly. Now that she had returned to Qingyang City, she had no intention of leaving so hastily. She also recalled that when she was a child, her nanny had told her that when her mother married into the Marquis household, her dowry had been extraordinarily lavish, so much so that it was said to be 10 miles of red dowry. However, her mother had only lived in the Marquis household for a year before tragically passing away. That dowry, by rights, should have been left to her. #### Chapter 19, Reclaiming what belongs to me. Now that she had returned, she must reclaim what was rightfully hers. Not long after, the 4th Prince hurried to the prince's residence, his stern face shadowed with sorrow. As he was led into the study, his gaze immediately fell upon Clara Blake, seated on the chaise. It had been years since they last met. Her once youthful face had now fully matured, bearing an uncanny resemblance to her late mother. "My child." The 4th Prince, known for his stoic demeanor and aversion to frivolity, had not shed a single tear even when his first wife passed. Yet at this moment, upon seeing Clara Blake, his eyes grew moist. "Grandfather." Clara Blake gently placed Peter down and quickly stepped off the chaise to bow respectfully. The 4th Prince hurriedly moved forward to support her. "My child, you've suffered so much. Peter, don't grieve. With me here, you'll stay at the prince's residence from now on. I will protect you, no one will dare harm you." Clara Blake felt a sting in her nose as emotion swelled. After 5 years in this world, this was the first time she truly felt familial warmth. Thank you, grandfather. Peter isn't gone, he will live a long life, just like you. Clara Blake looked at the elderly man before her, warmth spreading in her heart. The fourth prince was overjoyed. His great-grandchild wasn't dead. He quickly turned his gaze to the chaise, where a delicate child lay sleeping peacefully. Though the child's complexion was a bit pale, his breathing was steady. Unable to resist, the fourth prince stepped closer to observe the child carefully. Though the prince's residence was filled with offspring and grandchildren, he had never seen one as endearing as this little one. If not for the child's sound sleep, he would have already scooped him up for a cuddle. Come, bring my great-grandchild. We're going back to the prince's residence. The fourth prince turned to take Clara Blake's hand, looking directly at the young woman before him. Her face, so much like her late mother's, stirred old memories. He still remembered how young Clara Blake used to cling to him affectionately. Among all his grandchildren, only Clara had ever held a special place in his heart. Clara Blake hesitated, glancing at the elderly man. Grandfather, I want to return to Blake Estate. The fourth prince froze. What? You want to return to Blake Estate? Do you know what's there? Clara Blake interrupted him, raising her voice. I must return to Blake Estate to reclaim what is mine. Her determination brought tears to the fourth prince's eyes. This child's temperament mirrored that of his late wife, stubborn and resolute. Years ago, when Linda married into Blake Estate, her mother had prepared an exceptionally lavish dowry. The prince's residence treasury was nearly halved to accommodate it. Combined with the dowry from his late wife, it was a fortune worthy of the grandest celebrations. Linda carried this vast wealth into Blake Estate, only to fall ill and pass away within a year, leaving behind a month-old child. According to the laws of Vermilion, a woman's dowry should be entirely inherited by her children. If she has no children, it can be reclaimed entirely by her natal family. At that time, the royal family presented a detailed list of Linda's dowry when she married into the Blake Estate. This included cash, jewelry, antiques, promissory notes, farmland, estates, houses, and even dozens of dowry maids, wet nurses, and more. The royal family demanded that William seal everything and save it for Clara Blake to use as her dowry when she got married in the future. William, fearing that the fourth prince would take the dowry back to the royal estate, immediately agreed to the conditions and even formalized them in writing. However, when Clara Blake was 14, an incident occurred at the temple, followed by her disappearance during pregnancy. With Clara Blake's life or death uncertain and her reputation ruined, the fourth prince lost face and never came to the Blake Estate to claim the dowry. The matter was thus left unresolved and unmentioned. Grandfather, rest assured, Clara will reclaim everything mother left behind there. That is the dowry you left for Clara. How could I let anyone else take advantage of it? Chapter 20, The Power to Protect Oneself. Clara Blake smiled at her grandfather, determination clearly written on her beautiful face. But the fourth prince still looked worried. Clara, a fragile young woman, how could she stand up against the ferocious women in the back courtyard of Blake Estate, a place full of cunning and ruthless individuals? Clara Blake raised her hand, a milky white aura swirling gently in her palm. Grandfather, rest assured. I have the ability to protect myself and will not let anyone harm me or Peter. A white aura. 8th rank. The fourth prince was astonished, then overjoyed. The once delicate girl had grown up. Over the years, she must have encountered extraordinary opportunities to achieve such accomplishments. After all, he himself was the fourth prince and had been practicing martial arts for decades, yet he had only reached the 6th rank. And in the Vermilion Empire, even a 6th rank was considered a master. However, would the Blake Estate accept Clara now? Having a child out of wedlock was a taboo in the Vermilion Empire. While there were no laws against it, public scorn alone could ruin someone. Clara Blake understood her grandfather's concerns and said, Grandfather, don't worry. Just take me back to Blake Estate and tell William Blake that if they refuse to keep me, then my marriage will be entirely handled by you. Also, demand that he return my entire dowry. The fourth prince nodded. Clara was right. From what he knew of William Blake, there was no way he would return the dowry to the royal family. The Blake estate was already struggling, with few competent individuals left. They lived extravagantly, with countless concubines in the household and a horde of children. Their finances had long been stretched thin. If they had to return Linda's dowry, the Blake estate would likely face bankruptcy. Using this as leverage, the fourth prince was confident he could keep Clara there. But what about Clara's future? Grandfather, don't worry. I've been through a lot over the years. I'm no longer the Clara of the past. A small estate like Blake Estate is nothing to me. A cold glint flashed across Clara Blake's beautiful face. Every time she thought of Charles Anderson's words, that Peter's illness was due to absorbing too many toxins while in her womb, she felt an uncontrollable fury and a strong desire to crush the bones of the one who poisoned her. She didn't care about the dowry itself. She was now incredibly wealthy, far beyond anything the Blake estate could ever dream of. 10 Blake estates combined wouldn't match her assets. However, she couldn't bear to let those vile people squander her mother's belongings. Why should they get to enjoy what her mother left behind? The fourth prince, unable to sway Clara Blake's resolve, had no choice but to follow her wishes. He immediately sent an invitation to William Blake, informing him that Clara Blake would be returning to Blake Estate in 3 days and instructing him to prepare accommodations in advance. Clara, when you face challenges, consult your grandmother and don't act recklessly. Although your martial skills are impressive, you can't rely solely on your temper. Remember, the foundation of living in this world isn't just about having strong fists. The fourth prince gave careful instructions, truly reluctant to let her leave like this. Clara Blake nodded repeatedly. Don't worry, for Peter's future, I will certainly not act recklessly. Grandfather, Peter will visit you often. Peter hugged the fourth prince's leg, looking up sweetly. The corners of the fourth prince's eyes grew moist again. This child, so intelligent and adorable, but why must he suffer from this illness? Clara Blake handed a prescription to the fourth prince. Grandfather, these medicinal ingredients are priceless treasures. I am still searching for them. With your vast connections, please help me find them when you have time. Regardless of the cost, I can afford it. I ask for your help, grandfather. The fourth prince understood that this prescription was surely a remedy to save his great-grandson's life. He carefully tucked it into his chest and agreed immediately. The carriage gradually disappeared into the distance. The fourth prince stood silently at the door for a long time, staring after the carriage that had long vanished, his aged face filled with sorrow. So, what does the Marquis residence look like? Is it bigger than my grandfather's royal residence? Chapter 21, Oh dear, those gossiping ladies are too much. Peter blinked his sparkling eyes, curious as ever, and asked. Clara Blake tried to dig through her memory. What did the Blake estate look like again? The Duke's manor and the Blake estate weren't far apart, just about the time it took to burn a stick of incense. Soon enough, the carriage stopped in front of the Blake estate's gates. Mother and daughter stepped down from the carriage, taking in the view of the Blake estate before them. The crimson gates towered high, flanked by 2 majestic stone lions. The green stone steps were intricately carved with exquisite reliefs. Everywhere you looked, the place exuded an air of unmatched luxury. After racking her brain for a while, Clara Blake finally recalled the old appearance of the Blake estate. It seemed a bit different from how it looked now. Could it be that during the years she was away, they had spruced up the entire estate? Clara Blake smirked. They could renovate all they wanted, as long as they didn't spend her money. The crimson gates remained tightly shut, with no one coming out to greet them. As soon as mother and daughter stepped down from the carriage, a crowd of passers-by gathered around, eager to gossip. Their words were sharp, full of insinuations about virtue and womanly conduct, accusing Clara Blake of being shameless and tarnishing the family's reputation. At first, the insults were mild, but they soon escalated, turning into a cacophony of market-like jeers, as if they were afraid the whole world wouldn't hear them. Clara Blake glanced at the crowd, her mind as clear as a mirror. These people, seeing her step down from the carriage and immediately swarming around, had clearly been waiting in advance. Knowing she was returning today, it couldn't have been anyone else but her grandfather's people, Charles Anderson, Henry Owen, and the rest of the Blake estate's inhabitants. Clearly, Charles Anderson and Henry Owen had no reason to do such a thing. "Mom, are these gossiping ladies insulting someone?" Peter Blake looked at the distorted faces of the adults, his delicate brows furrowed tightly. Clara Blake gently patted her son's head and softly replied, "Yes, they are insulting someone." Peter noticed his mother secretly winking at him and immediately understood. His small hand raised, and a flash of light emerged from his spatial ring. A handkerchief appeared in Peter's hand. Holding one corner, he waved it gently, releasing a strange fragrance that wafted through the air and into the noses of everyone present. "Oh dear, Peter, what are you holding? That's not a handkerchief laced with bone-eating powder, is it? Why did you take it out? If people smell that powder, it'll cause big trouble." Clara Blake subtly glanced at Peter with approval, then pretended to cry out in alarm. Peter blinked his mischievous round eyes and chimed in, "It's just a handkerchief, Mom, you're overreacting." Clara Blake said, "This isn't an ordinary handkerchief. It's dusted with bone-eating powder. This powder is highly toxic, it makes people itch down to their bones. Even if they scratch until their skin peels off, the itching won't stop, and eventually, their whole body will fester and die." As Clara finished speaking, the crowd surrounding her suddenly began scratching themselves, their faces filled with terror. If what Clara said was true, it was as if she had just pronounced their death sentence. In no time, the once chatty group scattered in disarray. The unbearable itching, coupled with the fear of their bodies festering as Clara described, was too much to handle. Clara Blake raised a pale blue porcelain veil and calmly said, "This is the antidote. Whoever tells the truth will get it. I'll talk. It was Lady Young from the Marquis Manor who ordered us to do this. Yes, she forced us. Miss, please spare us, we beg for your mercy." Clara Blake's eyes gleamed as she softly said, "I am the daughter of the Marquis Manor, and she is just a concubine of the manor. Logically, we are family. Why would she do such a thing? Are you telling the truth?" A woman in her 30s, unable to endure the torment of the itching any longer, suddenly knelt before Clara Blake with a loud thud and cried out, "We've told you everything. Lady Young wanted to tarnish your reputation so you wouldn't be able to marry. We don't know her exact reasons, but please, miss, have mercy on us." Chapter 22, Chaos. "Bring it on, who's afraid?" Peter furrowed his delicate brows and pouted, "Mother, who is concubine Young? Why does she want to tarnish your reputation? What does she gain from it?" The 4-year-old boy genuinely didn't understand. Concubine Young and his mother had no grievances or enmity, so why would she want to harm her? Clara Blake didn't answer Peter's question. Instead, she turned her head to look at the group of people kneeling on the ground and said indifferently, "Get out of my sight. Before you dare to wrong Clara Blake, make sure to wash your necks clean. Now, scram." With that, she threw the jade bottle to the ground. The bottle shattered into pieces, releasing a faint fragrance into the air. The itching on everyone's bodies immediately disappeared, and they fled in panic. In the mansion, the old madam of the Marquis household sat with a cold expression, staring at her son. One wanted to bring the granddaughter back, while the other didn't want to see his daughter ever again. Standing beside them was concubine Young, dressed in a willow-green long dress with a silk belt cinched at her waist. Her hair was styled in an elegant updo, adorned with a jade hairpin. Her black hair was as glossy as clouds, and the jade pin accentuated her delicate, youthful face. Despite being 30 years old, she was still as beautiful as a maiden in her 20s. She glanced sideways at the angry William Blake and chuckled softly, "My lord, why are you upset with the old madam? She only cares for her grandchild. Acting this way will make others think you're cold-hearted and unfeeling." William Blake grew even more irritated upon hearing this. The old madam wasn't his biological mother, merely a stepmother in name. Over the years, he had tolerated her condescending attitude toward him, but now she wanted to meddle in his children's affairs too. And still put on a facade of kindness. Disgusting. The more William Blake thought about it, the angrier he became. He stood up abruptly and said coldly, "There's no need to discuss this further. If she wants to return, I won't stop her. Whatever you want to do, I don't care. Just pretend I don't exist." With that, he stormed off in anger. A triumphant smile appeared on concubine Yang's lips. She bowed to the old madam and then followed after William Blake. Wang Mama hurriedly brought over a cup of hot tea, her face filled with worry. But when she saw the old madam smiling, she was puzzled. Could it be that she was too angry to react? Seeing Wang Mama's confusion, the old madam patted her hand and said with a smile, "Do you think I'm angry?" Wang Mama didn't understand, and the old madam leaned back against her cushion, saying, "In all these years, have you ever truly seen me angry?" Wang Mama thought about it and realized she hadn't. The old madam had only occasionally been provoked by that conniving concubine Yang. "Please enlighten me, old madam," Wang Mama said earnestly. If the old madam didn't explain, she feared she would never understand. The old madam knew Wang Mama's honest and straightforward nature. She wasn't one for many words. In the past, the old madam hadn't confided in her, fearing she might be deceived by some fox-like woman. But now that the situation was settled, there was no harm in telling her. "Back then, when I shamelessly begged for a marriage alliance with the fourth prince's household, I had already made up my mind. I would endure everything for the sake of the Blake family's future and glory. If William Blake showed even a shred of filial piety, I would spend my later years peacefully in this mansion, turning a blind eye to everything." Chapter 23, Finally, the day has come. The old madam's face was filled with sorrow. Linda was a good child, but her fate was unfortunate. Meeting me ruined her lifelong happiness, not to mention it cost her life. Madame Wang grew even more indignant. Has the Lord ever thought about who helped him secure the Marquis title? Without the old madam, he would have remained a mere concubine-born son. What right would he have had to inherit the Marquis title? Without the old madam arranging this marriage, where would his wealth and glory come from? Without the fourth prince's backing, all the trouble he's caused over the years would have been enough to strip him of his title, or worse. And yet, he resents the old madam. The old madam snorted coldly. After Linda died, for the sake of the Marquis household's reputation, I pretended not to know and told the prince she died of illness. Who would have thought they'd turn their schemes on Clara? Despite my countless efforts to protect her, they still managed to slip through. Clara's life was ruined, and that's partly my fault. Madame Wang, equally grief-stricken, felt her heart ache. The eldest young lady was raised by her, and yet such a tragedy befell her. The old madam herself fell gravely ill over this matter, nearly losing her life. She was in a coma for months but thankfully woke in time to save the young lady. However, who could have anticipated the carriage escorting the young lady out of the city would meet with an accident? Witnesses claimed to have seen the young lady fall down a slope. At the time, she was pregnant. Though the slope wasn't high, it was enough to take her life. The old madam and the fourth prince sent many people to search for her. Apart from a bloodstain at the foot of the slope, there was no other trace. Some said the young lady had been dragged away by wild beasts, but the old madam refused to believe it. She was adamant that the young lady was still alive and would one day return. Finally, they had waited long enough for that day to come. Let's not talk about this anymore. Go out to welcome them, they should be arriving soon. The old madam's wrinkled eyes finally softened. Her Clara had finally returned. From now on, she would live only for Clara. Whatever Clara wanted, she would make it happen. Even if it meant taking William Blake's life, she wouldn't hesitate. If she had once helped him inherit the title, she could now overthrow him and find someone else to succeed. Although Blake estate had no legitimate heirs, there were plenty of concubine-born sons. Madame Wang, accompanied by the servants of Ansho Hall, went to the estate gates. The grand, gilded doors slowly opened, revealing a young woman in a white dress holding the hand of an adorable little boy. Madame Wang's eyes reddened as soon as she saw Clara Blake. This child, whom she had once cradled and raised, must have endured countless hardships over the years outside. Clara Blake smiled at Madame Wang and greeted her, "Madame Wang, how is grandmother?" Madame Wang quietly wiped her tears, stepped forward to hold Clara Blake's hand, and looked her over from head to toe. Seeing her rosy complexion and smooth skin, she was relieved that Clara didn't appear to have suffered much. "The old madam is in good health, but she talks about you every day. She's lost her appetite and can't sleep well, growing thinner as a result. Now that you're back, the old madam is overjoyed. She even ate a full bowl of rice at lunch today and said she plans to live to 180 years old to see the young master grow up and get married," Madame Wang said cheerfully. Clara Blake understood the underlying meaning in Madame Wang's words but said nothing more. Holding Madame Wang's hand in one of hers and Peter's hand in the other, she walked into Blake estate, surrounded by the servants. Peter curiously observed Blake estate, frowning again and again before finally speaking up, "Mother, this Blake estate doesn't seem as grand as great-grandfather's residence. Why does everyone here act so haughty? Does the Marquis of Blake hold a higher rank than great-grandfather?" Chapter 24, The Shameless Pair. Madame Vaughn, hearing this, hurriedly gestured for Peter to keep completely silent, signaling him not to babble recklessly. "Young master, don't go spouting nonsense. If these words reach the master's ears, there will surely be a big commotion." Clara Blake retorted, "Commotion? Let it be, who's afraid of who? If he doesn't make a fuss, I'll make sure to stir things up myself. I came back to Blake estate to settle scores. Anyone who mistreated me, secretly harmed me, or coveted what belonged to me and my mother, every single one will be exposed for all to see." Her stunning phoenix-like eyes swept over the servants who were sneaking glances at her, a bunch of dog eyes, clearly showing no respect for her. She had no intention of warming cold hearts with her sincerity upon her return. Did they think she was still the naive girl she once was? The sneaky dog eyes immediately dispersed and rushed to report Clara Blake's words to their respective masters. Naturally, among them were spies sent by William Blake and concubine Duong. When the report reached him, William Blake was so enraged that he overturned the table. The fine porcelain tea set shattered into pieces, and the intricately carved rosewood furniture was destroyed under the force of his palm. At that moment, concubine Duong swayed her snake-like figure as she approached, her soft, delicate hand gently stroking William Blake's chest. "Master, why must you be angry with a mere girl? Even if she is unfilial, she is still your daughter. So what if she has the old madam and the fourth prince supporting her? She is your flesh and blood, after all. Big or small matters, don't they all follow your arrangements?" She blinked flirtatiously, continuing to speak to William Blake. "Now she's a wreck, dragging along a child with her. Marrying her off is impossible. Tell me, who in Xinjiang City doesn't know about her disgraceful past? Keeping her for life wouldn't be a big deal for you, would it?" A cold glint flashed in concubine Yang's eyes. "A lifetime, whether it's long or short, depends on fate." William Blake was no fool. How could he not understand the implications in concubine Yang's words? He knew perfectly well how Clara Blake's mother had died, the state of Clara Blake's body, how the carriage carrying Clara Blake had tumbled down the mountain, every detail was as clear as daylight to him. His chest, heaving violently, gradually calmed down. Tai Van was right, her return would only mean one more mouth to feed. As long as she wasn't allowed to marry, nothing would change. His tightly pressed lips finally relaxed into a faint smile. He reached out to take the small, restless hand and gently pulled her into his embrace. His large hands roamed, teasing her until the person in his arms panted heavily, tugging repeatedly at his clothes. The two indulged shamelessly, ignoring the maids and attendants in the hall. Unabashedly enacting their spring scene. Just as the two were entwined and drenched in sweat, little Peter Blake took advantage of everyone's diverted attention and strutted into the hall where the spring scene was unfolding. Peter Blake blinked his bright, gem-like eyes, observing the two bare bodies with a contemplative expression. The two remained completely unaware, lost in their sea of lust. Mother said that if a man's little bird is small, he's not a real man. Peter stroked his chin, looking at concubine Duong with an expression holding 3 parts pity, then said, "Your act doesn't compare to Perry at Chuanhu Pavilion. Clearly uncomfortable, yet you pretend to enjoy it. Such a shame your skills are still lacking. Miss Feng Tian has already turned over a new leaf, should I invite her to teach you a thing or two?" Hashtag Chapter 25, Sarcasm and Relentless rebuke. The two figures, stark naked, a young man and woman, froze as if turned to stone. When had this brat snuck in? How long had he been watching? And what did his words mean? William Blake's little fellow immediately wilted. He glanced at his little bird, then at concubine Duong's bewildered face, his own expression turning as dark as the bottom of a pot. Concubine Duong hurriedly got up to dress, her mouth babbling incessantly, "My lord, don't listen to his nonsense. You're the best, the man among men." I was in ecstasy, not faking it at all. Hearing this, William Blake's mood eased somewhat, and his expression lightened a little. Peter curled his lips, sneering, "Seems like this lady here has seen quite a few birds before, hasn't she? Otherwise, how could she compare?" William Blake, who had just raised his hand, froze mid-air, his face darkening once more. He glared at Peter Blake and barked, "You wild brat, do you even know where you are?" Judging by the boy's attire, though he had a noble air, his rough clothes resembled those of commoners, he must have been some servant's child sneaking into the manor. Peter Blake nodded enthusiastically, "Of course I know. My mother said this place will be my home in the future. There's no part of the estate I'm not allowed to go." Concubine Duong, finally dressed, glared at Peter Blake. This brat with his shameless talk had clearly come to disrupt her relationship with the master. Could it be that some other concubine sent this little spy here? Her slender, bamboo shoot-like finger pointed directly at Peter as she scolded, "Who are you? Who brought you into the manor? Speak now, or I won't let you off." She was used to acting arrogantly in the estate, especially with William Blake doting on her more and more. With the role of the main wife still vacant, she had started to see herself as the mistress of the house. No one reminded her otherwise, and she herself seemed to have forgotten her true station. "Here you are." From the wide-open main door, a woman in flowing white attire stepped in gracefully. Her stunningly beautiful face bore a faint smile as she glanced at Madame Yang, silently praising her. This woman seemed to have been overly favored by time, though her face was over 30, it bore no traces of age. Instead, it exuded the allure of a mature woman, with a full bosom and a slender waist like a water snake. "Father, after visiting grandmother, I hurried to see you." Unexpectedly, Peter was mischievous and ran ahead of me. "If there's been any discourtesy, I beg your forgiveness." She slightly bowed with respect to William Blake, her demeanor reverent, as if the words the servants had just conveyed hadn't come from her at all. William Blake coldly assessed Clara Blake, slowly buttoning his coat as he pondered how to discipline this audacious girl. Clearly, Yang Taiyun was far less composed than William Blake. Before he could think of how to handle Clara Blake, she hastily spoke up, "Clara, how do you raise your child? No sense of propriety at all. Does he think he can go anywhere he pleases? Thinking about her intimate moment with the master being interrupted by a child, her heart burned with discomfort. Clara Blake raised her head, smiling gently at Yang Taiyun. Her red lips parted slightly. Does Madame Yang intend to teach me about propriety? Then please enlighten me. How is it that even a concubine can wander freely, but the true mistress is not allowed to set foot here? Is there such a principle in this world? Concubine. Yang Taiyun gasped, drawing a sharp breath. Having lived in the Blake estate for over 10 years, no one had ever dared to call her a concubine to her face. Even the old madam at Ansho Hall had never humiliated her so. Her face turned beet red with anger, far more infuriated than when caught in an intimate act. What did you just say? Her slender finger pointed straight at Clara Blake, trembling uncontrollably. Clara Blake raised an eyebrow at her trembling finger and nonchalantly replied, "What's the matter? Didn't hear me clearly? Should I have my son repeat it for you?" Clara Blake winked at Peter, who immediately understood and shook his head vigorously. "My mother just said you're a concubine." "I don't know what a concubine is, but since it has the word lowly in it, it can't be anything good. My mother and I are the true masters of this household. If a concubine can come here, why can't the true masters? Mother, am I right?" Peter grinned sweetly, as if he weren't just insulting someone but reciting poetry, awaiting his mother's praise. Clara Blake nodded approvingly, reaching out to stroke Peter's head with a smile. "Yes, Peter is absolutely right. Later, I'll explain to you what a concubine is." Watching the mother and son act in unison, Madame Yang was so furious she nearly fainted. Luckily, William Blake was there to catch her in time. Taking advantage of the opportunity, she collapsed into his arms, sobbing pitifully, putting on her most sorrowful act to gain his sympathy. Over the past decade, she had used this tactic countless times, always with success. Whenever she played this card, William Blake would inevitably grant her every request. William Blake truly had feelings for concubine Yang, otherwise, how could he let a mere concubine manage the entire household of the Marquis residence? Years ago, William Blake married Linda Anderson, the legitimate daughter of the fourth prince. Though Linda Anderson was beautiful, she lacked charm and was always rigidly proper, exuding an unapproachable air of nobility. Moreover, William Blake, being a second son with a less distinguished background compared to Linda Anderson, often felt inferior in her presence, especially when faced with her untouchable demeanor. Not long after their marriage, Linda Anderson became pregnant and subsequently refused intimacy with William Blake. At the peak of his youth and vitality, William Blake struggled to endure the loneliness of a cold bed. Chapter 26, Why Would I Not Dare to Return? Concubine Yang was originally a dowry maid who had grown up alongside Linda Anderson. Linda treated her well, and while the maid was not as elegant or refined as Linda, her eyes sparkled like spring water, making her stand out among the other servants. Yet, human greed knows no bounds. Despite Linda Anderson's kindness, the maid could not suppress her ambition. One late night, under the guise of delivering tea, she climbed into William Blake's bed. With her beauty and sweet, persuasive words, she quickly won his favor. Ignoring the objections of the old matron, William Blake took her as a concubine and soon elevated her to the status of a secondary wife. "Shut your mouth, you shameless thing." William Blake openly defended concubine Yang. His gaze was full of affection when he looked at her, but when he turned to Clara Blake, his expression was one of disdain. That face, so much like his late wife's, was one he loathed to see. Shameless? Father, are you discussing shamelessness with your daughter? Clara Blake smiled radiantly, her eyes casually glancing at William Blake's disheveled clothing. If shamelessness were the topic, then the two people before her, engaging in such behavior in the main hall in front of so many servants, surely had no sense of shame themselves. William Blake, flustered by her sharp gaze, turned red with embarrassment and barked, "You've seen me, now leave." Clara Blake curtsied to him, her eyes cold. A pair of shameless adulterers, a despicable couple. She led Peter Blake out of the main hall. They hadn't gone far before they heard concubine Yang's sobs, accompanied by her coquettish whining and William Blake's attempts to comfort her. "Mother, I don't like them." "They don't like us either," Peter Blake said sadly. Although William Blake was his grandfather, he wouldn't even spare Peter a glance, treating him completely differently than the way his maternal great-grandfather did. Clara Blake smiled and said, "Silly child, if you don't like them, then let it be. Why feel sad? They're not worth your sorrow, understand?" To mother and son, spiritually connected, with just one sentence from Clara Blake, Peter immediately understood, his gloomy mood instantly dissipated. He had thought his mother would force him to curry favor with his grandfather, but it seemed he had misunderstood. Madame Wang returned to report to Lady Blake, detailing the first encounter between Clara Blake and William Blake. Lady Blake was both furious and amused, furious at William Blake, a Marquis, for shamelessly behaving so indecently in the main hall, utterly losing face, yet, hearing Clara Blake's response, she was overjoyed. This young girl, after years of absence, seemed to have matured, no longer the little girl who used to hide behind her. Clara Blake was introducing Peter to the surroundings of Blake Estate when a flash of red suddenly appeared, blocking the path of the mother and son. The person wore a long peach-colored dress, a jade pendant at her waist, embroidered shoes, and her hair adorned with a swaying jade hairpin, a typical appearance of a wealthy young lady. Clara Blake recognized her. In her memory, this person held a significant presence, Amelia Blake, the most favored daughter of concubine Yang in Blake Estate, 3 years younger than Clara Blake and just turned 16. Though younger, Amelia Blake had caused her no small amount of trouble in the past. "So it's you. You dare to return?" Amelia Blake sneered at Clara Blake, who was dressed in plain coarse fabric, with only a simple jade hairpin in her hair, lacking any grandeur of a Marquis' daughter. What irritated Amelia the most was that, despite this, Clara's beauty remained undiminished. Even in plain clothes, she exuded an innate noble aura. "This is my home. Why wouldn't I dare to return?" Clara Blake looked at Amelia Blake, the once little girl now grown into a beautiful young lady. However, despite her beauty, she was still the daughter of a concubine, raised by a concubine, and from head to toe, radiated a petty demeanor. Amelia Blake scoffed coldly, casting a disdainful glance at Peter Blake, and mocked, "After causing such disgrace, you still dare to return? Haven't you already brought enough shame to the Marquis' household?" "Humph. If you hadn't escaped quickly 5 years ago, the pig cage in the river would have been your resting place." Pig cage? Clara Blake's forgotten memories were ripped open once again. That night, 5 years ago, after obtaining William Blake's approval, concubine Yang secretly summoned the elders of the Blake bloodline, intending to drown Clara Blake in a pig cage. Fortunately, Lady Blake swiftly received the news and immediately sent people to take Clara away, leading to the carriage accident where the real Clara Blake lost her life, and the reborn Clara Blake took her place. "Dear sister, you're 16 now, aren't you? I heard you're still unmarried." "Well, that's understandable. A concubine's daughter, what respectable family would want to marry you? After all, people value one of two things, either wealth or status. A concubine's daughter without a main wife's backing surely wouldn't have a generous dowry. As for personal qualities, ha 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 ha." Clara Blake's every word struck directly at Amelia Blake's pain. From a young age, Amelia had been pampered, loved by her father and mother, and held great prestige within the Marquis residence. Unfortunately, her status was confined to the Marquis residence. Outside of it, she was merely a concubine's daughter, born of a concubine, lacking a royal maternal family like Clara Blake, and without the protection of the Blake family's matriarch. Respectable families looked down on her, while smaller families didn't meet her standards. What was she to do, become someone's concubine? Her pickiness over the past 2 years had led to this situation. If a few more years passed, she'd be labeled as an old maid, with no one willing to ask for her hand. Grinding her teeth, Amelia Blake retorted, "So what if I'm a concubine's daughter? At least I'm better than you, a woman infamous throughout the land. I am a pure maiden who can't find a husband. Do you really think a worn-out shoe like you, dragging along an illegitimate child, could ever get married?" "Mother, was the woman just now in the main hall stripping and embracing Grandpa her mother?" They look so much alike. A mischievous glint flashed in the eyes of the boy with peach blossom-like features. This vile woman dared to bully his mother. Clara Blake stifled her laughter and loudly replied, "That's right. Her mother is quite something, not only sneaking into men's beds at midnight but also stripping in front of everyone." Amelia Blake's beautiful face immediately turned pale. She knew her mother well, and the incident of stripping in the main hall wasn't even the first time. The fact that she had reached marriageable age without any suitors was largely due to this. The Marquis residence was bustling with people, and such stories couldn't be hidden. In the capital, who didn't know that William had a beloved concubine, adored beyond measure? She was highly skilled in martial arts and so enchanting that William often lost control. The traces of their passion could be found all over the backyard of the Marquis residence, under the moonlight, by the stream, anywhere they felt the urge, they would strip and indulge. The servants of the Marquis residence had long grown used to it. With a mother like that, what respectable family would dare to marry her? Even Amelia herself didn't want such a mother, but what could she do? At this moment, Amelia Blake's face turned red with anger, and she covered her face before running away. Under the arrangement of the Blake family's matriarch, lunch was set up in the side hall of Anshow Hall, summoning all the concubines and their children from the Blake estate to meet Clara Blake. Chapter 27, plotting. Once again the old matriarch's display of authority was deliberate. She wanted everyone in the estate to know that Clara Blake had returned and that she remained the rightful mistress of Blake estate. As the sole legitimate daughter of the Blake Marquisate, Clara held a status second only to the old matriarch and the Marquis himself. Naturally, this included Peter as well. Eleanor Reed feigned illness and did not attend, while Amelia Blake and Kevin Blake, her siblings, didn't even bother showing up. The old matriarch didn't say much about it, instead allowing the concubines and their children to come forward and greet Clara. She then instructed the steward to visit Eleanor Reed's chambers with a message. Since she was unwell, she should focus on her recovery and hand over the keys to the storeroom. Clara, though newly returned, needed to begin preparing her dowry. Hearing this, Eleanor Reed was so enraged she nearly fainted. Clara had only just returned and already had her eyes on the storeroom. Did they think she was a ghost that could be so easily dismissed? She was unwilling to relinquish control over the household, but she knew she couldn't outmaneuver the old matriarch. She hid the storeroom keys on her person, knowing the old matriarch wouldn't resort to forcibly seizing them. However, she understood this wasn't a long-term solution. That seemingly kind elderly woman was, in truth, a formidable opponent. Even the maids and servants in her courtyard were skilled, capable of subduing the entire estate if necessary. Left with no other choice, Eleanor Reed sent someone to summon the Marquis back to the estate. At this point, only he could stand against the old matriarch. William Blake rushed home, and upon hearing the situation, grew deeply concerned. He knew his mother's temperament well. She was indifferent unless she decided to intervene, and once she did, no one could oppose her. Although he was the head of the estate and the Marquis appointed by the Emperor, he was acutely aware of his position. Without the backing of the fourth prince's household and the old matriarch's influence, how could a mere illegitimate son like him have become the Marquis? The problem was that the storeroom was no longer what it used to be. Eleanor Reed gripped the bronze key tightly, her beautiful face darkening with malice. She dismissed the servants, leaned in close to William Blake, and whispered, "My lord, I have a plan. If she won't let us live in peace, then we should neither hold back nor hesitate." William Blake shook his head. "No, if she dies, I'll have to observe mourning rites, which would harm my prospects." Eleanor Reed sneered. She doesn't need to die. We just need to make her neither fully alive nor dead. That way, you won't have anything to worry about. Her hatred for the old matriarch ran deep. If it weren't for that old woman's interference, she would have long since become the legitimate lady of the house and wouldn't have to endure Clara Blake's mockery. In the end, William Blake nodded. He didn't hold much affection for the old matriarch. Years ago, when she allowed him to inherit the title of Marquis, he hadn't felt any gratitude. In his eyes, she had only chosen him out of necessity, unable to find a more suitable candidate. Furthermore, his biological mother had been the old matriarch's maid, a maid who betrayed her mistress. This complicated relationship left him estranged from the old matriarch. That evening, during a family dinner, Clara Blake presented William Blake with a list of dowry items provided by the fourth prince. Grandfather said these are the dowry items Mother left behind after her passing. He has agreed to let me use them as my own dowry. William Blake took the list, already knowing its contents without needing to read it. Years ago, he had reluctantly signed an agreement allowing the fourth prince to hold on to the dowry, even stamping it with his seal. What belongs to you will always be yours, he said. When the time comes for your marriage, it will all be given to you. Why bring this up now? William Blake was visibly upset, glancing at Eleanor Reed, who gave a slight nod. His gloomy mood somewhat improved. We must do an inventory, just in case someone has been up to no good. If there's any loss, this old woman will have a hard time explaining to the fourth prince. The old matriarch cast a sharp look at Eleanor Reed, causing her to shrink back slightly. The Blake estate only appeared imposing on the surface. Since the old Marquis passed away, the estate had gradually declined, relying solely on the remnants of the old Marquis's prestige. Although William Blake held an official position, it was merely a nominal post with little income. The family's assets had also dwindled due to poor management. Eleanor Reed, known for her extravagant spending, had long dipped into Clara Blake's dowry. The cash was gone, turned into Eleanor's private funds, and the farmlands and shops had been transferred to her and her children. What remained in the storeroom were merely some household items, neither useful nor sellable. Seeing William Blake pretend not to hear, Eleanor Reed remained silent. The old matriarch merely snorted, refraining from further comment, and began her meal. Madame Wang promptly served the old matriarch a small bowl of 5 treasure abalone porridge. Eleanor Reed's son, Kevin Blake, seeing this, ordered a servant to fetch him a bowl as well, but Eleanor quickly stopped him. That's the old matriarch's favorite dish. You should eat something else, she said, placing a piece of fish into his mouth. The old matriarch said nothing, instead handing the bowl of abalone porridge to Clara Blake. Clara, this used to be your favorite dish. Madame Wang quickly served the old matriarch another small bowl. Only then did the old matriarch pick up her white porcelain spoon and take a few small bites. Clara Blake lifted the bowl of abalone porridge to her nose, inhaling its aroma. It was indeed fragrant, but there seemed to be a peculiar smell mixed in. After a moment of thought, her expression suddenly changed to one of horror. She turned to look at the old matriarch, who had already consumed nearly half the bowl. There's poison in the porridge, she exclaimed, rushing forward to knock the bowl from the old matriarch's hands. She swiftly sealed the old matriarch's pulse points to prevent the poison from spreading further. Clara Blake glared at Eleanor Reed and William Blake, her fury blazing. It must have been this treacherous pair who orchestrated this. If anything happened to the old matriarch, Clara vowed to make them pay with their lives. In this moment, William Blake, a fourth-rank martial artist, felt an immense pressure, an overwhelming aura from a powerful individual, making him tremble inwardly. Was this aura coming from Clara Blake? He wasn't sure as he looked at Clara Blake, only to see her and Madame Wang quickly assisting the old matriarch out. However, Clara Blake's departure did not take away the suffocating pressure that nearly crushed him. He glanced around and saw that aside from Peter Blake, the others were women and children he was very familiar with. He looked at Peter Blake with a hint of fear in his eyes. Could it be him? He shook his head. Impossible. He's just a child, how could he emit such a strong aura? Peter Blake clenched his fists tightly before slowly releasing them, his small lips pressed together before finally relaxing. He stood up, grabbed a large chicken drumstick, and casually walked away. Seeing his mother's anger earlier, he almost took action, but unfortunately, he didn't know who had poisoned the food. If he did, he would have certainly taught that person a lesson. In Ansho Hall, the old matriarch had taken the medicine Clara Blake prepared. Luckily, it was discovered in time, so no harm was done. Thinking back to the scene where Eleanor Reed stopped her son from eating the porridge, it was likely Eleanor Reed's doing. She then noticed that William Blake's expression hadn't changed at all, he must have known about it too. Disappointment was evident on the old matriarch's face. Although she had no maternal bond with William Blake, they had shared the same boat for so many years. Yet, he was so heartless. She thought to herself, if he could be cruel to his own flesh and blood, then to an old woman with no blood relation to him, what couldn't he do? Thinking like that, she also felt relieved. Clara Blake, do you resent your father? The old lady leaned against a soft pillow embroidered with golden threads. Noticing Clara Blake's complexion didn't look too well, she asked. Clara Blake shook her head and replied, not exactly resentful. Between him and me, there's no such thing as a father-daughter bond, so naturally, there's no resentment. The old lady seemed very satisfied with this answer. What she feared most was Clara Blake being heartbroken after seeing her father's true nature. This was a relief. Grandmother, you must be more cautious in the future. Eleanor Reed will certainly not give up and will definitely look for another opportunity to harm you. The old lady gently patted the back of Clara Blake's hand and slowly said, Clara Blake, don't worry about your grandmother. I will ensure you regain everything that belongs to you, find you a good family, and see you settle down in happiness. Clara Blake couldn't help but feel touched. In the 5 years she had been in this world, aside from her maternal grandfather, only her grandmother truly cared for her. Late at night, under the cold moonlight, a shadow as swift as a black streak moved into Blake Estate. The figure moved quickly, heading straight to Clara Blake's quarters. Inside the room, Clara Blake's previously closed eyes suddenly opened wide, her gaze icy. She gently moved her son's small hand resting on her arm, quietly leapt off the bed, and with a flick of her hand, extinguished the only light in the room. At that moment, a dark figure slipped in through the slightly open window. Clara Blake swiftly turned her palm, white energy burst forth from it, and her body gracefully ascended, unleashing a powerful strike toward the figure whose face was concealed by a black scarf. In the darkness, no one could clearly see each other, relying only on the breath to attack. The opponent seemed unwilling to confront Clara Blake directly, merely dodging. The shadow flickered, skillfully evading Clara Blake's next attack, and darted straight toward the bed. Clara Blake panicked, hurriedly flying forward to block the way, but saw the shadow move like lightning, lifting Peter from the bed. The palm strike aimed at the shadow quickly shifted direction to avoid harming Peter. Who are you? Put him down. Clara Blake, like an enraged lioness, glared at the figure in the darkness. The person carefully held Peter, seemingly inexperienced in carrying a child, worried about holding him uncomfortably. The movements appeared stiff and almost comical. So quick to forget me. But I remember you very well. The man spoke in a deep, pleasant voice, deliberately lowering his volume, as if afraid of waking Peter, who was sound asleep. That voice, it was unmistakably someone from the Heaven's Flame Hall. Those eyes that resembled Peter's by 80%, who exactly was he? What was his purpose in coming here? Julian Quinn. Clara Blake stared intently at Peter in his arms, her hands forming a seal, ready to strike at any moment. A faint smile appeared on Julian Quinn's face, hidden beneath the black scarf, seemingly pleased that Clara Blake had not forgotten him. Miss Blake, don't worry, I won't harm Peter. He tightened his grip on the arm holding Peter. In the darkness, although Peter's face was not clearly visible, the sound of his steady breathing and the faint scent of medicine emanating from the child made his chest inexplicably tighten. Master Quinn, why aren't you staying in your sky-splitter hull? What brings you here? Clara Blake couldn't afford to let her guard down. What exactly was this man scheming? If it came to a fight, she knew she wouldn't be his match. I'm just here to visit my life savior. Julian Quinn slowly turned around, gently laying Peter down and covering him with a thin blanket. After all, he was still a child, sleeping soundly without the vigilance of an adult. Life savior? Clara Blake was completely clueless about the story between the two of them. Hearing this now, she was quite surprised. How could Peter possibly become his life savior? Julian Quinn glanced at Peter again and spoke slowly, ask him tomorrow. As for his illness, I already know the cause. The elixir you need, I'll lend you a hand. With that, Julian Quinn gave Clara Blake a deep look, turned, and stepped through the window. In just a few swift movements, he left the Marquis residence and vanished into the dark night. Clara Blake stood rooted to the spot, her thoughts in turmoil. Fragments of memories began piecing together like shards forming a picture. Back then, she had been poisoned by the seductive toxin of the wicked Eleanor Reed and locked in a meditation chamber. Unexpectedly, a man suddenly barged in. The man seemed to be somewhat unusual as well. When the two met, it was like dry wood encountering fire, igniting fiercely. His eyes were exactly like the alluring eyes of Julian Quinn. Although she hadn't seen his face directly, there was a vague feeling that he might be the man who had a fateful encounter with Clara Blake 5 years ago. The news of the return of the William family's young lady quickly spread throughout the city. Over the past 5 years, the scandal had gradually faded from memory, but now it was brought up once more. Of course, when mentioning this scandal, one couldn't forget the people involved, such as Clara Blake's former fiancé, Charles Anderson. For the moment, a dark cloud loomed heavily over the second prince's residence once again. The most delighted individuals were William Blake and Eleanor Reed. This was exactly the outcome they desired. The more tarnished Clara Blake's reputation became, the less likely anyone would want to marry her. If no one married her, the Blake estate wouldn't need to explain anything to the fourth prince. Today, Henry Owen came to the William residence seeking an audience with Clara Blake. Coincidentally, Amelia Blake, who was preparing to attend a banquet, spotted him. Seeing Henry Owen dressed elegantly, exuding charm, and possessing a handsome face, she couldn't help but take a closer look. The servants mentioned that he was the second son of the prestigious Owens bloodline family. In the Vermilion Empire, noble families were few, and the Owens bloodline was considered immensely powerful and wealthy beyond imagination. Even members of the royal family would show them respect. This demonstrated just how influential they were within the Vermilion Empire. Upon learning that the Owens bloodline's young master had come to meet Clara Blake, Amelia immediately devised a plan. She stepped forward, pretending to be demure and virtuous, personally escorting Henry Owen to Enthor Hall. I'm quite curious, how did the young master of the Owens bloodline come to know my elder sister? Amelia Blake held a silk handkerchief over half her mouth, gazing at Henry Owen with eyes as sparkling as autumn waters. For an ordinary man, how could he resist such allure? Unfortunately for her, this was Henry Owen. Henry Owen, who was constantly surrounded by countless beauties, was already far too familiar with such petty tricks from women. Clara Blake hasn't told you yet? She and I are like fated enemies bound to cross paths. Henry Owen couldn't help but smile. Every time he thought of Clara Blake and Peter storming the mountain camp, he couldn't stop himself from laughing. That domineering mother and son duo was truly cunning. Amelia Blake let out an awkward laugh, feeling deeply uncomfortable inside. Traveling with him all this way, she had never seen him laugh like that before. Now, just the mention of that vile woman made him smile so brightly. Since you're acquainted with my sister, then surely the young master of the Owens bloodline must know about her story as well. Amelia Blake spoke slowly, carefully observing Henry Owen's expression, only to see the smile on his face quickly disappear, his eyes filled with gloom as he said coldly, "It's improper for a younger sister to gossip about others behind their back." Amelia Blake slightly furrowed her brows, but the corners of her lips revealed a faint, indifferent smile. "So, he does care after all." "Humph, just a withered flower and fallen willow. Men like it only out of fleeting interest, merely captivated by the appearance for the moment. Amelia talks too much, thinking that the young master is her elder sister's friend. There are currently many rumors outside, making her elder sister very heartbroken. She originally wanted to ask the young master to comfort her elder sister on Amelia's behalf." Amelia Blake put on a small, aggrieved face, her eyes brimming with tears as she looked at Henry Owen, appearing very pitiful. Chapter 29, about to be deceived by her. Even a seasoned player in the field of romance like Henry Owen couldn't help but feel a twinge of compassion when faced with this delicate little face. Just as the two were walking toward the wall of Ansho Hall, Peter Blake, who was sunbathing on the wall, overheard their entire conversation. He immediately jumped down, landing beside Henry Owen, and sweetly called out, "Uncle of the Owens bloodline." Henry Owen's face lit up with a radiant smile the moment he saw Peter. "Peter, where is your mother?" Peter pointed toward the wall. "Mother is inside, having tea with great-grandmother." "Is there something wrong?" The little boy tilted his adorable head and asked with a playful grin. Henry Owen bent down to pick Peter up, gently tapping the boy's nose, and said with a laugh, "Today, the trading house is hosting an important auction. The spirit medicine family has brought a rare spiritual herb. I figured your mother might be interested, so I came to inform you." Hearing that he could go out to play, Peter was overjoyed. He had been cooped up at home for days and was bored to death. "That sounds great, but buying spiritual herbs costs a lot of money." "Uncle, you know my mother and I just rejoined the family, we're dirt poor." Peter glanced at Henry Owen's expression, speaking so convincingly it almost seemed real. Henry Owen couldn't help but laugh helplessly. This little rascal was always so money-minded. Before Henry Owen could respond, Amelia Blake, who had been ignored this entire time, finally found an opportunity to interject. "Peter, dear, if you need money, Auntie will give it to you." "Why ask the Owens bloodline, uncle?" Peter turned his head to glance at Amelia Blake coldly and said, "What's wrong with Auntie today? Yesterday, you said you wanted to kick me out of the house. Why are you being so nice to me now?" "Humph, Mother always said there's no need to be polite with two-faced people like her." Henry Owen's expression changed instantly, and his gaze toward Amelia Blake became filled with hostility. So, she had been acting this whole time. Was he about to be deceived by her? What a cunning woman. Amelia Blake was eager to explain but saw that Henry Owen didn't even spare her a glance. He simply carried Peter into Ansho Hall. She was so furious she stomped her feet, but there was nothing she could do. Ansho Hall was not like other places. Without the old matriarch's permission, no one could enter freely. When Clara Blake heard about the appearance of a spiritual herb, she naturally couldn't let it slip by. As an alchemist, her passion for spiritual herbs far exceeded that of ordinary people. It was still the VIP lounge on the second floor of Owen Trading. Beside him were Charles Anderson and the seventh Princess, Helen Anderson. When Clara Blake and Peter arrived together, Charles Anderson's calm eyes flickered slightly. After some consideration, he finally stood up and headed to Henry Owen's private VIP lounge. Clara Blake nodded perfunctorily to Charles Anderson and then turned away, paying him no further attention as she observed the crowd in the auction hall. Today was even more bustling than the day of the white blood herb auction, likely due to the presence of the spiritual medicine clan. A familiar figure appeared amidst the crowd, dressed in a deep green robe embroidered with water thread patterns, wearing a jade crown, with a suave demeanor. Who else could it be but her despicable father? And behind William Blake was another striking figure, Amelia Blake, the person who despised her like cats and dogs. This father-daughter duo had also come to participate in the auction. Could they be eyeing the spiritual medicine as well? As soon as Amelia Blake entered the hall, she began searching for Clara Blake. When her gaze swept over the VIP seats on the second floor, she spotted Clara Blake lounging lazily in a sandalwood chair, sipping tea. Beside her was Peter Blake, accompanied by two handsome men. Amelia recognized Henry Owen, but the other man had a noble aura and a cold expression. "Father, look at Clara Blake. She's at it again, flirting with men everywhere. Aren't you going to do something about it?" Amelia Blake tugged at William Blake's sleeve, pouting in displeasure. Her expression was full of irritation. What kind of sorcery had this woman used to make even Henry Owen personally invite her? William Blake followed his daughter's gaze and indeed saw Clara Blake seated in the VIP lounge. Beside Peter were Henry Owen and Charles Anderson. Pulling Amelia's hand back, he lowered his voice and said, "Don't point randomly. That's Henry Owen and the second prince. You can't afford to offend them." Though he held the title of Marquis, it was an empty honor without real power. In contrast, Henry Owen and the second prince were formidable figures, one a legitimate heir of a prestigious family, likely to inherit the position of patriarch, and the other a direct son of the emperor with a chance to ascend the throne. Both were not to be trifled with. But how did Clara Blake come to know them? Henry Owen was one thing, but Charles Anderson? Clara Blake had clearly humiliated him before. Did he not mind? In the VIP lounge on the third floor, a man wearing a mask sipped wine, his deep almond-shaped eyes exuding charm and radiance, an unparalleled presence. The auction began with some low-grade pills and martial skills, which did not stir much excitement in the hall and fetched unimpressive prices. However, when the auctioneer placed a sparkling crystal makeup box before the crowd, everyone's attention was immediately captivated. The box, adorned with 5 types of gemstones, emitted a mysterious glow, its breathtaking beauty leaving people in awe. Even Clara Blake, who rarely cared for jewelry, couldn't take her eyes off it. The auctioneer opened the box, revealing a pure white jade hairpin resembling snow. Most strikingly, the tip of the hairpin bore a vivid red hue, reminiscent of a red plum blossom in the snow. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and the entire hairpin radiated an extraordinary beauty. Legend has it that this was the ornament of the celestial maiden of the Moon Palace before she ascended to immortality. It is called the fairy hairpin and has a unique feature: as long as lovers hold it, the tip of the hairpin will emit a red glow. Hence, it is also known as the love-testing hairpin, the auctioneer said slowly. Amelia Blake gazed at the fairy hairpin, captivated. Just looking at it made her desire to possess it, and after hearing the auctioneer's introduction, she liked it even more. She quickly acted coyly toward William Blake, demanding the jade hairpin. William Blake felt a bit troubled. Coming here today was merely because he couldn't refuse Amelia's request. He had no interest in spiritual pills or other such items, and even less interest in women's trinkets. Most importantly, this item clearly appeared to be of immense value, and with his financial resources, it might be beyond his reach. Amelia Blake continued to whine persistently, and William Blake, unable to scold his daughter in front of everyone, reluctantly nodded in agreement. In his mind, he thought that if it wasn't overly expensive and within his acceptable range, he could buy it as part of her dowry in the future. Unexpectedly, the starting price announced by the auctioneer immediately made him abandon the idea and regret coming here today. The starting price is 100,000 silver taels, with a minimum increment of 1,000 taels per bid, the auctioneer announced, scanning the room to signal the start of bidding. Soon, people began bidding, with the price quickly rising from 110,000 taels to 35,000 taels, and it continued to climb. When the price reached 80,000 taels, the number of bidders decreased significantly, as it was evident many felt that a single hairpin wasn't worth such a high price. 100,000, Henry Owen suddenly raised his paddle and bid 100,000 taels. The auctioneer was initially overjoyed but then noticed the bidder was the second young master, nearly fainting in frustration. What kind of stunt was the second young master pulling this time? Was he here to cause trouble again? What are you standing there for? Hurry up and announce the sale. Henry Owen lazily glanced at the auctioneer and said indifferently. The auctioneer, fuming with anger, had no choice but to comply and prepared to declare the sale. But just at that moment, Charles Anderson suddenly raised his paddle. Chapter 30, You Did It on Purpose. 101,000 taels. Henry Owen clearly did not expect Charles Anderson to join the bidding. This girlish trinket was something he had never cared about. What was going on today? The auctioneer didn't bother with what Henry Owen was thinking. Taking advantage of Henry's momentary daze, they quickly raised the silver gavel, ready to finalize the deal. But then, the distinguished guest wearing a mask on the third floor suddenly raised their paddle. 110,000. The auctioneer was delighted and turned to Charles Anderson, gauging his reaction. Charles Anderson hesitated briefly before raising his paddle again. 120,000. Buying a hairpin for 120,000 taels was certainly a sky-high price. However, this didn't seem to be the time to debate whether it was worth it or not. This was also a matter of pride. How could a prince lose to an unknown nobody? The corners of the masked figure's lips curved into a faint smile as they raised their paddle once more. 150,000. Gasps echoed throughout the auction hall. The grand finale treasure of the day hadn't even appeared yet, and the bidding was already this intense. Charles Anderson gritted his teeth, the number card in his hand almost buried under the weight of his fury. Just as he was about to raise the paddle again, the seventh princess beside him hurriedly stepped forward, pressing his hand down firmly and whispering softly. Royal brother, do not act out of momentary anger. Charles Anderson, consumed by rage, suddenly regained his composure. His royal sister was right, he could not act impulsively, as it would be detrimental to the grand plan. The auctioneer, seeing that Charles Anderson had stopped bidding, regretfully announced the conclusion. The item was finally claimed by the distinguished guest with number 038 on the third floor. Clara Blake set down her teacup, stood, and walked toward the intricately carved railing. She raised her head to look at the third floor, where a man leaned casually against the railing, meeting her gaze. Those enchanting almond-shaped eyes, filled with a playful smile, it was indeed him, Julian Quinn. Peter followed Clara Blake's gaze and noticed a man wearing a mask looking at his mother. Though the man's face was hidden, those eyes, how could Peter ever forget them? Uncle Quinn. Peter raised his head and called out to Julian Quinn. Julian Quinn's gaze shifted to Peter, the amusement in his eyes deepening. This clever little boy had recognized him even with the mask on. Mother, can I go to Uncle Quinn's side? Peter asked Clara Blake. Clara Blake lowered her head, her brows slightly furrowed. What are you doing? Uncle Quinn owes me 100,000 gold coins, I'm going to collect the debt. Peter grinned mischievously, resembling a money-loving kangaroo, entirely ignoring Clara Blake's annoyed expression. Come back early. Clara Blake sat back in her original spot, reminding Peter. Henry Owen grabbed Peter's arm and hurriedly said, Don't go, seeing him wearing a mask, he's definitely not a good person. Let him go. If he dares to harm Peter, I will flatten his Sky Division Hall without hesitation. Clara Blake spoke nonchalantly. The Heavenly Hall. Henry Owen hastily let go of Peter, recalling how Peter addressed the other man as Uncle Quinn. Could it be that he is Julian Quinn? Charles Anderson was also secretly astonished. Julian Quinn had always been humble and avoided the spotlight, yet he was attending this auction. What could have piqued his interest? Was it merely this hairpin? Or perhaps the rare elixirs of the elixir family? And how were Clara Blake and her child acquainted with Julian Quinn? Peter dashed away, and the auction hall once again erupted into a buzz. A faint medicinal fragrance wafted through the air, invigorating Clara Blake. She quickly raised her head and saw the auctioneer retrieving a jade box from an iron chest. Around the auction stage stood several elite guards, their expressions cold and alert, their eyes scanning the surroundings. Each had their hands firmly on the hilts of their swords, ready to strike at the first sign of trouble. The jade box was slowly opened, revealing the treasure inside, a pale green fruit, about the size of a newborn's fist, shaped like a small mythical beast, exuding a refreshing fragrance that lifted the spirit. Wasn't this the legendary Qilin fruit? The Qilin fruit was the miraculous remedy Clara Blake had long yearned for, one of the 5 missing ingredients for the blood transformation pill. She had visited the Elixir family numerous times but had never seen the Qilin fruit before. It must have been hidden in a secret location. The Elixir family truly lived up to its reputation, being able to cultivate such a nearly extinct divine medicine demonstrated their profound heritage and unparalleled expertise. The Qilin fruit is a treasure that every martial artist dreams of. The energy it contains is enough to elevate one's cultivation by 2 levels. What would normally take years of hard work for an ordinary person can be achieved with just 1 Qilin fruit. Who wouldn't go crazy over it? However, such fervor comes with a price to pay. Starting price, 10,000 gold taels. Each bid raises the price by 1,000 taels. Today, those attending the auction are all prominent figures, many of whom are extravagantly wealthy. The paddles are raised one after another, and the price quickly climbs to 70,000 gold taels. William Blake was truly astounded today. Before becoming a Marquis, he was just a concubine-born son, receiving only a dozen or so silver taels each month. Even after becoming a Marquis, his monthly stipend was merely 100 taels. His life of luxury was entirely thanks to his late wife. Yet, the luxury he once considered extravagant paled in comparison to the scene before him today. It was like comparing a shrimp to a whale. When the price surged to 100,000 gold taels, the number of bidders dwindled, leaving only a few in the VIP section. The common folk in the main hall had long since given up. 13,000. Charles Anderson raised his paddle, his gaze flickering toward Julian Quinn on the 3rd floor. Julian Quinn was engrossed in a conversation with Peter, paying no attention to the commotion of the auction. After Charles Anderson raised his paddle, no one dared to make a sound. Who didn't know he was the second prince? Once the second prince set his sights on something, who would dare compete? All eyes turned to Julian Quinn, anticipating a good show. Julian Quinn seemed uninterested in the Qilin fruit, engrossed in chatting with Peter, with no intention of raising his paddle. The auctioneer appeared disappointed, raising the gavel high, ready to bring the bidding to a close. 13,001. A clear, gentle voice, like a breeze, drifted from the VIP section. Though not loud, it skillfully caught everyone's attention. Amelia Blake exclaimed, "Father, Clara Blake just placed a bid. Is she crazy?" William Blake's hands trembled with anger. What was that girl thinking? 13,000 gold coins, did she think they were pebbles on the road? Even selling the entire Blake estate wouldn't amount to that much. Charles Anderson, however, was not surprised. Clara Blake was an alchemist, and naturally, she wouldn't pass up a miraculous item like the Qilin fruit. Moreover, high-ranking alchemists were often exceptionally wealthy. A mere 13,000 gold coins probably meant little to her. 14,000. Charles Anderson raised his paddle again. He was determined to obtain the Qilin fruit. At this moment, he was on the verge of breaking through from the 6th to the 7th rank and desperately needed the Qilin fruit's assistance. 140,001. Clara Blake remained indifferent, as if 140,000 gold coins were merely pocket change. Charles Anderson gritted his teeth, glaring at Clara Blake, and growled. 150,000. Clara Blake stayed calm as water. 150,000, and won. She looked back at Charles Anderson, her eyes sparkling, the corners of her exquisite lips curving into a faint smile resembling cherry blossoms, half mocking, half disdainful. Charles Anderson was fuming, grinding his teeth in frustration. 160,000. 160,000, this was his limit, the maximum amount he could muster. Sure enough, Clara Blake calmly bid 160,001, leaving Charles Anderson so furious he felt like spitting blood. Helen Anderson, equally enraged, glared at Clara Blake and roared, "What's the meaning of this? You're doing this on purpose, aren't you?" #### Chapter 31, Speak Your Mind, No Need for Violence. Clara Blake glanced at Helen Anderson and said calmly, "I'm simply buying what I want. What's wrong with that? Is there a rule against it in the auction house?" Charles Anderson held back Helen Anderson, who,